A messenger is walking toward your throne right now, and you already know what he's going to say. The gods have spoken. It's time for you to die. Not metaphorically. Not eventually. Today. This is how it has worked for generations in your kingdom, and every king before you has accepted it without question. The priests declare it. The king obeys. No argument, no trial, no appeal. When you simply go somewhere quiet, and you end your own life, because that is what a good king does. When the gods decide his time is over, you are about to become the first king in the history of your civilization to say no. This actually happened, not a legend, not a myth, softened by centuries of retelling. A Greek historian named Diodorus Siculus wrote it down, not that long after it occurred, and what he describes as one of the most audacious acts of political defiance in the ancient world, carried out by a king almost nobody outside of academic circles has ever heard of, ruling a kingdom that built more pyramids than Egypt itself and still doesn't get a fraction of the attention it deserves. His name, at least the name history remembers him by, was Ergamenes, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why an entire priesthood wanted him dead, why tradition said he had no choice but to comply, what he did instead, and how that single decision helped set the stage for a moment, centuries later, when a one-eyed queen from this same kingdom would face down the entire Roman Empire and walk away with better terms than almost anyone else Rome ever fought. Let's set the stage properly, because you need to understand exactly how powerful this civilization already was, and exactly how much authority these priests actually held, before you can appreciate what it meant to defy them. We're in the Kingdom of Kush, a civilization that ran along the Nile River south of Egypt, in what's now Sudan, for well over 1,000 years. This wasn't some minor neighboring tribe living in Egypt's shadow. At its height, Kush was wealthier than Egypt in certain periods, militarily dominant enough to march north and take the throne outright. And for roughly a century, Kushite kings didn't just fight Egypt. They ruled it directly, crowned as pharaohs over both kingdoms simultaneously. This period is known to Egyptologists as the 25th dynasty, and it began when a Kushite king named Kashta extended his authority into Upper Egypt. His son, Pa, finished the job, marching an army north and conquering the rest of the country, an achievement he was proud enough of to have carved in detail onto a massive stone monument. A victory stela that still stands today. That stela is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about Pa you wouldn't expect from a conquering king. According to his own inscription, when defeated Egyptian rulers came to submit to him, he refused to even receive several of them in person, because they had not purified themselves properly beforehand, considering them ritually unclean. Meanwhile, he specifically praised and welcomed rulers who arrived, having observed the correct religious purity, treating conquered Egyptian nobility not as prisoners to be humiliated, but almost as fellow custodians of a religious tradition he took more seriously than the Egyptians he was defeating. He describes inspecting the Nile flood levels during his campaign, like a man genuinely more interested in whether the annual inundation would be good for the harvest than in the war he was actively winning. This wasn't the portrait of a foreign conqueror trampling a civilization. It was closer to a king who believed sincerely that he was restoring something Egypt itself had let slip. The kings who followed him, names like Shabaka, Shabitku, and Taharka, ruled as legitimate pharaohs of Egypt, restoring temples, reviving classical Egyptian art and religious practice after a period of decline, in what some historians describe as a genuine renaissance for Egyptian civilization, driven entirely by rulers from the south. Taharka in particular shows up somewhere you might not expect. The Bible. He's mentioned by name in the books of both Kings and Isaiah, described as the King of Kush, whose approaching army helped force an Assyrian retreat from Jerusalem, a rare case of a Kushite ruler leaving a mark on multiple ancient literary traditions at once, not just Kushite or Egyptian records, but texts still read by millions of people today who likely have no idea the king mentioned was Kushite at all. And here's a detail that should genuinely surprise you if you've only ever pictured Egypt when you think of pyramids. Sudan, the heartland of ancient Kush, contains more pyramids than Egypt does, well over 200 of them, spread across 3 separate royal burial sites. They're not built like the ones you're picturing. Kushite pyramids are small by comparison, rarely more than 30 meters tall, and built at a much steeper angle, closer to 70 degrees rather than Egypt's gentler slope, giving them a sharp, narrow silhouette unlike anything in Giza. Oh, smaller, steeper, less famous, but far more numerous all the same. An entire civilization built an empire's worth of monumental architecture in the shadow of its more famous northern neighbor, and most of the world simply never learned its name. That dominance didn't last forever. Assyrian armies eventually pushed the Kushite pharaohs back out of Egypt in the 7th century BCE, ending direct rule over the north. But Kush itself didn't collapse. It simply retreated south, back to its own heartland, and continued as an independent, powerful kingdom for centuries more, centered first around a city called Napata. This is where our story really begins. Napata sat near a striking, isolated mountain called Jebel Barkal, a flat-topped rock formation rising abruptly out of the desert, with a distinctive pinnacle at one end. Both Egyptians and Kushites looked at that pinnacle and saw something specific in its shape, something resembling a rearing cobra, the same sacred symbol worn on the crowns of pharaohs for millennia. Long before Ergamenes was born, Egyptian pharaohs expanding south had already identified this mountain as sacred, home to a version of the god Amun himself, and built a major temple complex there. One later, Kushite kings would expand into an enormous religious center of their own. This wasn't a minor local shrine. Jebel Barkal functioned as something like a southern Karnak, a parallel seat of Amun's authority, to rival the great temple complexes of Egypt itself. And because the priesthood at Napata controlled that mountain, that temple, and the interpretation of the god's will, they controlled something far more valuable than land or gold. They controlled the king's legitimacy. Here's the system, as Diodorus describes it. When the priests decided, through omens, prophecy, or whatever internal process they used, that the gods no longer favored the reigning king, they would send him a message, not a suggestion, not a warning, a command. The gods have willed it. It is time for you to die. And the kings obeyed, generation after generation. A monarch with armies, wealth, and absolute political authority over an entire civilization, choosing to end his own life because a group of priests told him the gods demanded it. Sit with that for a second, because it sounds almost impossible from the outside. Why would anyone with that much actual power simply comply? The answer is that power and legitimacy are not the same thing. A king in this system wasn't just a military commander or an administrator. He was believed to be divinely appointed, his entire authority resting on the idea that the gods, through the priests, endorsed his rule. If the priests declared that endorsement withdrawn, a king who refused to comply wasn't just breaking a religious custom, he was declaring publicly that he ruled without divine sanction, which, in a society built entirely around that idea, could be a far more dangerous position than simply obeying and dying with his legacy intact. It's a bit like a modern leader whose entire authority depends on being seen as legitimately elected. Refuse to accept the result of the process that grants you power, and you might keep the throne physically, but you risk losing something the throne can't function without. For generations, that fear, or that faith, depending on how you look at it, was strong enough to make kings choose death over defiance. Then came Ergamenes. According to Diodorus, Ergamenes had been raised differently from the kings before him. He had been educated in the Greek philosophical tradition, likely through contact with the Hellenistic world to the north, in an era when Kush maintained active diplomatic and cultural ties with Ptolemaic Egypt. Historians generally connect this Ergamenes with a king named Archaeological, who probably reigned in the 3rd century BCE, a period when Greek learning, Greek governance, and Greek ways of questioning tradition were actively circulating throughout the region. Whatever exposure to that philosophy did to him, it apparently gave him something none of his predecessors had: the willingness to ask a question that, as far as we know, no king before him had dared to ask out loud. Why do I actually have to do this? When the priest's message arrived, ordering him to end his life, Ergamenes didn't retreat to prepare for death the way every king before him had. Instead, according to Diodorus, he gathered a group of armed men and marched directly toward the sacred precinct itself, the same temple complex from which the priests derived their authority. Imagine being one of those priests. For your entire life, and for generations before you, this ritual had one outcome. You deliver the message. The king accepts it. You watch him walk away to die, and the system continues exactly as it always had. Instead, you watch him walk toward you with soldiers and an expression that makes it very clear he has not come to discuss the matter. What happened next is described starkly in the historical account. Ergamenes and his men entered the temple and killed the priests. Not negotiated with them. Not exiled them. Killed them, ending in a single violent afternoon, a tradition that had shaped the fate of Kushite kings for as long as anyone could remember. You're allowed to have a complicated reaction to that. It's a brutal solution to a brutal problem, and Diodorus doesn't record any attempt at compromise beforehand. But understand what it actually accomplished. Beyond the immediate and irreversible violence of the act itself, Ergamenes didn't just save his own life that day. He permanently broke the mechanism by which an entire religious institution had been able to end the reign and the life of any king they chose to target. Here's where the story does something genuinely interesting, something that takes it beyond a single act of violent defiance and turns it into a real turning point in Kushite history. After eliminating the priests who held that power over him, Ergamenes didn't simply return to ruling exactly as before. He began actively distancing his kingship from Napata's religious establishment altogether. Historians point to a specific, physical piece of evidence for this shift. Kushite royal burials for centuries had taken place near Napata, close to the sacred mountain and the temple that had just tried to end his life. Around this period, the royal necropolis shifts to a different city entirely, Meroë, further south along the Nile. This isn't a small detail. Where a king chose to be buried, in a culture that took the afterlife and religious continuity as seriously as Kush did, was a statement about where real power and real legitimacy was now considered to reside. Moving the royal tombs away from Napata was, in a sense, moving the entire spiritual center of the monarchy out from under the priesthood's reach, permanently. Meroë would go on to become the beating heart of a new era of Kushite civilization, one historians usually call the Meroitic period. And this is where the story gets even stranger in the best possible way. Somewhere around this same general era, the people of Meroë developed their own writing system, a script scholars call Meroitic. It comes in two forms, a formal hieroglyphic-style version, used mostly for monuments, and a cursive everyday version, and it was used for centuries, well into the first millennium CE. Here's the genuinely bizarre part. In the early 20th century, a British Egyptologist named Francis Llewellyn Griffith managed to work out how the script was pronounced. He cracked the phonetic code, the actual sounds each symbol represents, which means, right now, scholars can pick up a Meroitic inscription and read it out loud, sound for sound, exactly as an ancient Kushite scribe would have spoken it, and still have almost no idea what most of it actually means. The underlying Meroitic language itself remains largely a mystery. It doesn't cleanly match any well-understood language family, and outside of royal titles, some funerary formulas, and proper names, most inscriptions remain effectively untranslatable. There are stone monuments standing today, carved with careful, legible writing that we can pronounce perfectly and still cannot fully understand, sitting in plain sight, waiting for a linguistic breakthrough that hasn't happened yet. Let's pause here for a second because it's worth connecting these threads back to Ergamenes directly. A kingdom that broke away from priestly control at Napata went on to build a new capital, a new burial tradition, and eventually its own independent language and script, one so distinct from anything around it that modern scholars still, when fully crack it open, you could make a real argument that the confidence to develop something that singular, that independent, traces back to a king who was willing to say the old rules, hallowed as they were, didn't have to be followed forever. That same confidence would be tested again, centuries later, in the most dramatic way possible. Against Rome. By the late 1st century BCE, Rome had annexed Egypt, and Kush suddenly found itself with a new, far more dangerous neighbor to the north than it had ever dealt with before. Tensions rose along the border. According to Roman sources, Kushite forces struck first, raiding Roman-controlled towns in southern Egypt, and in an act loaded with symbolic defiance, tearing down a bronze statue of the Roman Emperor Augustus himself. Rome responded the way Rome usually responded, with an army. Leading the Kushite resistance was a queen, a Kandake, the Meroitic title given to powerful royal women who commanded real political and military authority, not merely symbolic status. The Roman geographer Strabo, describing the conflict, records her as a striking, formidable figure, and modern historians generally identify her with a queen named Amanirenas. Strabo describes her, bluntly, as a woman of remarkably strong build, blind in one eye, having lost it, it's believed, in earlier fighting. A one-eyed queen commanding her own armies, leading the resistance against the single most powerful military force in the ancient world. The war dragged on with real losses on both sides. Roman forces pushed south and sacked a Kushite city. Kushite forces struck back hard enough that Rome, an empire not exactly known for negotiating generously with the civilizations it fought, eventually agreed to terms instead of simply crushing Kush outright. A peace treaty was struck on notably favorable terms for the Kushites, terms that reportedly included Rome waiving tribute payments altogether, an almost unheard-of outcome for a civilization Rome considered a peripheral, so-called barbarian power, and that bronze head of Augustus the Kushites tore down at the start of the conflict. Archaeologists actually found it, buried deliberately beneath the entrance steps of a temple at Meroë, positioned so that anyone walking into the temple would step directly on the face of the Roman emperor, forever, every single time they entered. It's on display today in the British Museum, one of the most quietly savage pieces of political theater to survive from the ancient world, discovered exactly where the Kushites intentionally buried it, roughly 2,000 years ago. Think about the distance between these two moments: a king refusing to accept a death sentence disguised as divine will, and centuries later, a one-eyed queen refusing to accept Roman dominance, burying an emperor's face under a doorway so an entire empire could be humiliated with every single footstep. Different threats, different centuries, the exact same underlying refusal to simply accept that power, once claimed by someone else, had to stay that way forever. Meroë's independence didn't last forever either. By around the 4th century CE, the kingdom had weakened, its trade networks disrupted, its political cohesion fading. The final blow came from a rising power to the southeast, the Kingdom of Aksum, in what's now Ethiopia. An Aksumite king named Ezana left his own inscriptions recording a campaign against the Kushite heartland, and shortly afterward, the written historical record of Meroitic civilization simply goes quiet. No dramatic final battle described in detail, no last stand preserved for us the way Ergamenes' defiance was. Just a slow fade into archaeological silence, an entire literate pyramid-building, empire-defying civilization that eventually stopped being written about at all. And then, for well over 1,000 years, it mostly stayed that way, buried under sand, remembered mostly in fragments, until the early 20th century, when archaeologists, including George Reisner, excavating around Napata and Jebel Barkal, and John Garstang, digging at Meroë itself, began pulling this entire civilization back into view. It was Garstang's excavation that turned up that buried bronze head of Augustus under the temple steps, sitting exactly where Kushite hands had placed it roughly 2,000 years earlier. Today, both Jebel Barkal and the archaeological sites of Meroë carry UNESCO World Heritage status, official recognition, finally, of a civilization that spent most of modern history being treated as a footnote to Egypt rather than the independent, defiant power it actually was. Let's pause on something important here too, because it's easy to let this slide by without noticing it. We're relying heavily on a single ancient source for the Ergamenes story specifically. Diodorus Siculus, writing in Greek, centuries removed from the events themselves, likely drawing on earlier accounts that haven't survived independently. Historians generally treat his account with real caution, the same caution you'd apply to any second-hand report of events from centuries earlier passed down through limited written sources. We don't have Ergamenes' own words. We don't have the priest's side of the story. What we have is a striking narrative, preserved because a Greek writer found it compelling enough to record, corroborated in broad strokes by the very real, physical shift of Kushite royal burial practices that archaeologists have confirmed on the ground, even if the exact details of that bloody afternoon in the temple can't be independently verified beyond Diodorus's account. That combination, a dramatic written record paired with physical evidence pointing in the same direction, is about as good as ancient history often gets. It's not absolute proof of every detail. It's enough to take the core of the story seriously. Think about what this story is actually asking of you. The same question it was asking of Ergamenes nearly 2,500 years ago. At what point does a tradition, a rule, a system you were raised inside of and told was simply how things work, stop deserving your obedience? You've probably never faced a literal death sentence disguised as religious tradition, but you've almost certainly followed a rule, at some point, simply because it was always the rule, without ever stopping to ask who benefits from you following it, or what happens if you don't. Most of the time, that instinct to comply keeps things running smoothly. Occasionally, someone looks at the system clearly enough to realize the rule was never really about the gods, or fairness, or tradition for its own sake. It was about power, held by people who very much wanted you to keep believing otherwise. Ergamenes looked at a death sentence dressed up as divine will, and for the first time in generations, someone with the power to refuse actually refused. We don't know everything about what happened after that bloody afternoon in the temple. We don't know exactly how his subjects reacted in the days that followed, whether there was resistance from remaining religious factions, or how quickly the new order at Meroë consolidated its authority. What we do know is that the tombs moved. The old system of priestly ordered royal suicide disappears from the historical record after this point, and a new phase of Kushite civilization, one that would eventually produce a language modern scholars still can't fully read, and a queen who buried an emperor's face under a doorway, begins to take shape in the years that follow. A messenger walked toward a king with a death sentence dressed up as the will of the gods. And for the first time in living memory, the king walked back toward the messenger instead of away from him. Everything that came after, the tombs at Meroë, the undeciphered script, the queen who stood her ground against Rome and won better terms than almost anyone else in the ancient world, all of it traces back to that single, violent decision to ask a question nobody before him had been willing to ask out loud. What happens when you finally do?